Gloria in excelsis Deo, et in terra pax unius bone voluntatis.
William Byrd, described by one contemporary as a glory to our race and a nightingale to our people, was a Catholic who spent most of his life and career in Elizabethan Protestant England. As a recusant, he was obliged to hide his faith, but his strong religious views found an outlet in his composition. He began his career at Lincoln Cathedral before being appointed a gentleman of Elizabeth's Chapel Royal in 1572 on the death of Robert Parsons, moving to London to take up the position. He would spend the next 20 years of his professional life living and working in London, before moving to Stondon Massey in Essex in the 1590s to be closer to his patron, John Peter. In this final stage of Byrd's life and compositional career, he wrote some of his most personal and intimate music, including 3 settings of the Mass and his Gradualia, an epic collection of music for the entirety of the Catholic Church year. The 3 Masses are particularly notable as they are the only works by Byrd published without title page. This is almost certainly because for a lot of Byrd's other music, it was possible for it to be conceived as for general use rather than specifically for the Catholic liturgy. But settings of the Mass Ordinary, the Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, Sanctus and Agnus Dei, were inescapably Roman and therefore forbidden. In fact, records tell us that a Jesuit who had recently met with Byrd and been part of a private Catholic celebration was arrested just for having copies of his music on his person. In this case, we think the Gradualia, but very possibly one of the Masses also. Both the Masses and the Gradualia were almost certainly intended for private performance in the houses of the Catholic nobility, like John Peter and his Ingatestone Hall home. A contemporary chronicle of one such meeting tells us that the place was most suited to our work and ministrations, not merely for the reason that it was remote and had a congenial household and company, but also because it possessed a chapel set aside for the celebration of the church's offices. The gentleman was also a skilled musician and had an organ and other musical instruments and choristers, male and female, members of his household. During these days, it was just as if we were celebrating an uninterrupted octave of some great feast. Mr. Byrd, the very famous English musician and organist, was among the company. These gatherings were potentially dangerous for those present, as the penalties for recusancy ranged from fines, imprisonment and the confiscation of lands, to death by beheading and disembowelment for Jesuit priests caught celebrating the Mass. Byrd himself largely escaped censure beyond fines, probably because he was a favourite of Elizabeth I and had some degree of royal protection. But he was acutely aware of the plight of his fellow Catholics, and you can hear this in his music. His Masses are notable because they were the only settings of these particular texts by an English composer for some 50 years, since the dissolution of the monasteries and the break from Rome by Henry VIII. Byrd was well acquainted with continental music and would have known Mass settings by some of his continental contemporaries, as well as some of his English forebears. But there are few models for the 3-part Mass, which we think was the second of the Masses to be published, although it's hard to establish a timeline, given that there's no date or title page, as I mentioned previously. We know that the 4-part Mass was based, in part, on a setting by John Taverner, his Mean Mass, as there were very few models with this texture for Byrd to draw on. Both the 3 and 4-part Mass are notable for their concision, which is hardly surprising given their likely performance context and the very real danger of being discovered mid-celebration by government-sanctioned priest hunters. Byrd does, however, show knowledge of the techniques used by some of his continental contemporaries in linking the movements of the Mass together. While continental composers would draw on a pre-existing musical model for this melodic material, Byrd instead chooses to write new melodies freely composed, which link the Kyrie, Gloria and Credo of the Mass for 3 voices and the Benedictus and Agnus Dei. The brevity of the 3-part Mass means that very little text is repeated, and when Byrd chooses to do so, it's for a reason, as at Catholicam in the Credo, where he shows his faith, I believe in one Catholic and Apostolic Church, by emphatically repeating the word. Byrd's belief in the importance and power of the words being set to music is nowhere better illustrated than in his introduction to the Gradualia, where he writes that, "In the very sentences, as I have learned from experience, there is such hidden and concealed power that to a man thinking about divine things and turning them over attentively and earnestly in his mind, the most appropriate measures, and by this he means measures of music, come, I know not how, as if by their own free will, and freely offer themselves to his mind, if it is neither idle nor inert." In writing his miniature masterpieces of the Gradualia and the 3- and 4-part masses, Byrd was making a very clear statement about his own faith, one which still resonates with us nearly 400 years later.